The gun pressed cold against the back of Elsie Hart's neck, and the man holding it was the one she had just agreed to marry. "Tell me where you hid it." Wesley Crane's voice was low, almost gentle, which made it more terrifying than if he had shouted. The saloon was empty at this hour, chairs turned upside down on the tables, the smell of stale whiskey soaked into the floorboards. Elsie's hands were flat on the bar top, her knuckles white, her breathing deliberately slow because she knew that panic was the only thing that could get her killed faster than the truth. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. The barrel pressed harder. "You have been reading his letters." "I know you have. Old Harlan told you where he buried the deed before he died, and you are going to give that information to me, or I am going to make sure nobody ever finds you under the dust of this town." Elsie's mind raced. She thought of the letter she had found tucked inside the lining of her father's old Bible, the cramped handwriting, the map sketched in brown ink. She thought of how she had memorized every line of it and then burned it, because something in her gut had already told her that Wesley Crane was not the man she thought he was. She had arrived in Rattlesnake Flats, Texas, 2 months ago on a promise and a prayer, answering a matrimonial advertisement in the Kansas City paper. She had believed foolishly that a new life waited for her. What waited for her was this. "Wesley," her voice did not shake, she was proud of that. "If you pull that trigger, you will never find the deed. I am the only person who knows where it is." A long, terrible silence. Then the sound of the saloon door banging open, and a voice she had only heard a handful of times but had already learned to trust said, with terrible calm, "Drop the gun, Crane. Drop it right now." Robert Sutton stood in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, his hat throwing a shadow across half his face. He held his rifle loose at his side, but his eyes were absolutely steady. Elsie had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who had already calculated every possible outcome and was at peace with all of them. Wesley Crane laughed, a hollow sound. "Sutton, of course. The drifter rides in to play hero. I said drop it." What happened next happened fast, and Elsie would replay it for years afterward. She dropped below the bar. The shot went wide. The rifle report cracked through the empty saloon like thunder. When she came up from behind the bar, hands shaking and heart slamming, Wesley Crane was on the floor, not dead, but groaning with a bullet through his shooting hand, his revolver skidding across the planks. Robert Sutton was already crossing the room, stepping over the man like he was nothing more than a piece of furniture moved out of place. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes moving over her face as if he was checking a list of things he needed to confirm were still intact. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. He nodded once. That was all. And somehow, in that single nod, Elsie Hart understood that she was going to have to go back to the very beginning if she wanted to understand how she had ended up here. How this quiet, complicated man had ended up here. And why, despite every dark secret and hidden motive and betrayal that lay between the start of this story and this moment in the saloon, she felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely safe. The beginning was a classified advertisement in the Kansas City Evening Star, dated March of 1879. Elsie had found it on a Tuesday. She remembered the day precisely because it was the day her landlady, Mrs. Polwarth, had informed her that the rent on her room would be doubled by the end of the month. Elsie was 23 years old, a seamstress by trade, a woman entirely alone by circumstance. Her mother had died of fever when Elsie was 15. Her father, Harlan Hart, a wandering man with a map in his blood and poor luck in his pockets, had drifted south and west until 2 years ago, when a letter had arrived from a place called Rattlesnake Flats, Texas, telling her he had found something magnificent and that she should come as soon as she was able. She had not been able to come. She had been nursing Mrs. Polwarth's elderly sister for 6 months, the only work available to her at the time, and by the time that obligation was finished, a second letter had arrived. This one was not from her father. It was from a man named Wesley Crane, who described himself as the mayor of Rattlesnake Flats, and who informed her with great professional sorrow that Harlan Hart had passed away from a bad fall, and that his personal effects and small property had been placed in trust pending notification of next of kin. Elsie had written back immediately, but the answers to her questions about her father's property came slowly and vaguely, in letters that seemed carefully constructed to say very little. Meanwhile, the Kansas City Evening Star lay open on her table one tired evening, and her eyes caught the advertisement. Wanted, a woman of good character and practical disposition for companionship and possible matrimony. Applicant should be comfortable with frontier life. Contact W. Crane, Rattlesnake Flats, Presidio County, Texas. She had stared at it for a very long time. Then she had written 2 letters, one to Wesley Crane responding to the advertisement, one to the Presidio County Land Office inquiring about a property registered under the name Harlan Hart. Wesley Crane responded within a week. The Land Office responded in 3. The Land Office told her that a plot of 40 acres northeast of Rattlesnake Flats had indeed been registered to a Harlan Hart in 1877, and that the status of that registration was, as of their most recent records, active and valid. Wesley Crane's letter was warm, eloquent, and almost persuasive. He was a man of standing in the community, he wrote. He was a widower. He was building something lasting in a growing corner of Texas, and he required a partner equal to the task. The West was no place for a woman alone, but it was a magnificent place for a woman of courage. Elsie had packed her 2 good dresses, her father's Bible, her sewing kit, and her savings. She had boarded a train in Kansas City on the 15th of April, 1879, and she had arrived in Rattlesnake Flats on the 22nd, stepping off the stagecoach into dust and heat and the wide, blank sky of West Texas. Wesley Crane had been handsome. That was the first trap, she thought later. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, with a broad smile and a firm handshake, and he had arranged for her to stay at the boarding house run by a widow named Clara Beaumont while the formal courtship proceeded, because, as he explained with charming modesty, a man of his position in the community had to be mindful of appearances. The boarding house was where she had first met Robert Sutton. He had been sitting on the porch when the buckboard brought her from the stagecoach stop, his long legs stretched out and his hat over his face, apparently asleep. Wesley had jumped down from the driver's bench and gone around to help her with her bag, and the figure on the porch had lifted the hat off his face and regarded her with dark eyes that were quiet and thoughtful, and entirely without the performance that she was already beginning to sense in Wesley Crane's every gesture. New arrival. He had said to nobody in particular. "Miss Hart," Wesley had said, in a tone that managed to be both welcoming and proprietary. "She'll be staying with Clara." Robert Sutton had set the hat back over his face and said nothing more, but Elsie had caught, just before the hat came down, a very slight furrow between his brows that she could not interpret. She had filed it away. Clara Beaumont was a plump, practical woman in her late 40s who had a habit of saying exactly what she thought about 2 seconds after she thought it, which meant that her opinions arrived with a breathless quality, as though they had been chasing her, and finally caught up. She showed Elsie to a clean, bright room on the 2nd floor and then stood in the doorway and said, "Wesley Crane is a very impressive man. He impresses everyone first." Elsie had looked up from setting her bag on the bed. "And second," Clara had pressed her lips together and said, "you should meet some of the other folks in town before you make any decisions." It was not, strictly speaking, an answer. The town of Rattlesnake Flats in the spring of 1879 was a place in the process of becoming something or becoming nothing, and the outcome was still genuinely uncertain. The main street ran north to south between a general store, a blacksmith shop, 2 saloons, a small church still missing half its steeple, and a handful of other establishments that had staked their futures on the question of whether or not the railroad would eventually push through the region. There were perhaps 300 souls within 5 miles, ranchers and their families, A few merchants, some itinerant workers, a small community of Mexican families who had been in this particular stretch of land longer than anyone else, and who regarded the Anglo arrivals with the long, patient wariness of people who had seen many arrivals come and go. Robert Sutton had been in Rattlesnake Flats for 6 months when Elsie arrived. He was 28 years old, and the story he told about himself was simple and left enormous spaces around it. He was from Tennessee originally. He had come west, as many men had, after circumstances made staying in one place inadvisable. He did occasional work for ranchers, was handy with horses, could turn his hand to most things. He was polite, kept to himself, paid his rent on time, and bothered nobody. Clara Beaumont, who bothered plenty of people, had told him she thought he was hiding something. He had agreed with her pleasantly, and she had been so disarmed by the agreement that she had never pressed further. The something that Robert Sutton was hiding was this. He had come to Rattlesnake Flats because of a man named Harlan Hart. Not because he knew Harlan Hart personally, but because he had been, for 2 years prior, working as an informal land investigator for a legal firm in San Antonio that handled property disputes across West Texas. The firm had received an inquiry from a woman in Kansas City, which had landed on Robert's desk at the moment he was between assignments, and which had struck him, for reasons he could not entirely articulate, as a situation that needed more than a letter in response. The inquiry was about Harlan Hart's property. The trail had led him to Rattlesnake Flats, where a few quiet conversations and several careful observations had convinced him that something was very wrong. Wesley Crane had arrived in the county 2 years ago with no discernible history and a great deal of ambition, had managed to have himself elected mayor through a combination of charm and selective generosity, and had in the 18 months since been quietly consolidating ownership of properties in the area through methods that were, on the surface, entirely legal and beneath the surface, built on coercion and deception. Harlan Hart's 40 acres sat at the center of a valley that contained an underground spring, which made it more valuable than almost any other piece of land within 20 miles. Harlan Hart had died, and Wesley Crane had moved with suspicious speed to take control of the estate. Robert could prove none of this. Not yet. What he needed was the original deed, which Harlan Hart had apparently hidden, either out of intuition or out of fear, in the weeks before his death. He had not anticipated that the man's daughter would arrive in response to a matrimonial advertisement. He had not anticipated her at all. The first real conversation between Elsie Hart and Robert Sutton happened on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after her arrival, when she came down from her room to find him at the kitchen table reading a newspaper while Clara Beaumont made coffee with the focused intensity of a woman conducting surgery. Elsie sat down across from him and said good morning. He said good morning in return. Clara put coffee in front of both of them and then pointedly left the room. Clara is subtle, Elsie said. She is many things, Robert said. A pause. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. He had a direct, unhurried way about him that she found unusual. Most men in her experience either talked too much to fill silence or used silence as a form of aggression. He seemed genuinely comfortable in it, like a man sitting in a chair that fit him well. "You were not pleased to see me arrive with Mr. Crane," she said. He looked up from the newspaper. "What makes you say that? You frowned." He was quiet for a moment. "I frown at many things. It doesn't always mean displeasure." "What does it mean when it does?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Concern," he said. It was a precise, careful word, and she turned it over in her mind for the rest of the day. Wesley Crane came to call that afternoon, bringing a small bunch of wildflowers and an invitation to ride out and see the valley the following morning. He was very good at this, she noted. He made every gesture feel like it had been invented specifically for her. He leaned close when she spoke, as if her words were the most interesting sounds in the world. He laughed at exactly the right moments. He touched her hand with confident gentleness and then released it, letting her decide whether she wanted more. She was watching him the way you watch a card dealer who shuffles too smoothly, and she hated herself a little for the suspicion, because she had come here hoping so hard that this could be simple and good. That evening, she finally opened her father's Bible. She had not been able to bring herself to open it since the letter from Wesley Crane had informed her of her father's death. It had sat in her bag like a stone she was carrying for someone else, heavy and specific. But that evening, with the desert sunset turning the window of her room amber and rose, she sat on the edge of the bed and opened it to the first page. Her father had written in the margins throughout, small cramped notes in the style of a man who was always running out of paper. There were pressed flowers between some pages, a habit she remembered from childhood. And between the book of Ezekiel and the book of Daniel, folded so small it had created a faint ridge in the paper of both surrounding pages that she had attributed to age, was a single piece of paper. She unfolded it with careful fingers. It was a letter, and it was addressed to her. Elsie. If you are reading this, then something has gone wrong. I hope you are reading this when I hand it to you myself, and explain it as a funny precaution of a man who got too careful in his old age. But if you are reading it after I am gone, I need you to know a few things. The land is real and it is yours. Do not let anyone take it from you. The deed is in an iron box under the floor of the old chapel at the edge of the Morales Ranch, third board from the door under the broken cross on the wall. I put it there because the man who calls himself the mayor of this county came to my claim 3 times asking questions that were not questions. He wanted to buy the land for nothing, and when I would not sell, he started to look at me differently. If I die before you get here, you need to go straight to the county seat and not to Wesley Crane and not to anyone he trusts. His name is Wesley Crane and he is not what he says he is. I love you. Come find the land. It was always meant for you. Papa. Elsie sat with the letter in her hands for a very long time. Then she folded it back up. She did not put it in the Bible. She memorized the location, then held the letter over the candle flame on her nightstand and watched it burn to ash. She thought about what to do for a very long time. And then she thought about the man at the breakfast table with the direct eyes and the word concern. She found Robert the next morning before Wesley came to collect her for the planned ride. He was at the stable behind Clara's, brushing down a bay horse with the patient strokes of someone who found the work genuinely satisfying. She closed the stable door behind her and he turned and looked at her without surprise. I need to know something, she said, and I need you to be completely honest with me. All right, he said. Who are you, actually? He set the brush down on the stall rail. He looked at her with those quiet, dark eyes. Then he told her. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. He told her about the legal firm in San Antonio. He told her about the inquiry her own letter had prompted. He told her that he had come to Rattlesnake Flats because he believed there was a significant injustice being built on this land, and that he had not yet found the evidence to stop it. He told her that Wesley Crane had at least 2 men in this town who were personally loyal to him beyond what loyalty to a mayor would normally require, which meant he had likely been paying them for something other than civic duty. He did not tell her that when she had walked into the stable and closed the door and looked at him with those steady gray eyes. He had felt something shift inside him that he had not felt shift in a very long time. Elsie listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "My father left a letter in his Bible. I burned it this morning, but I memorized it first." Robert was very still. She told him what it said. The silence after she finished was the kind that has weight and direction. "The Morales Chapel," he said. "Do you know it? I know where it is. I could reach it in an hour on horseback." He looked at her. "We can't go together, not today. Crane is expecting you." "I know." She paused. "I have to keep going along with the courtship. If he suspects I know anything, he'll move to take the deed before we can get to it." Robert looked at her with something that might have been admiration and might have been worry and was very clearly both. "That is a dangerous position." "Yes," she agreed, "but it is the position I am in." He picked up the brush again, not because the horse needed it, but because he needed to do something with his hands. "I'll ride out tonight, after dark. And if the deed is there, then we ride to Presidio and file the claim in person. With the original deed, the land is unambiguously yours." Crane can't touch it without a legal battle he would lose. He paused. It also opens the question of what happened to your father. The words sat between them. I know what happened to my father, Elsie said, quietly. Robert looked at her. I have always known, she said. I just needed someone to help me prove it. She left the stable before either of them could say anything more, and if her eyes were bright in the way that grief looks when it is very old and very controlled, Robert said nothing about it and would not have known what to say if he had tried. The ride with Wesley Crane that morning was a performance, and Elsie was a better actress than she had ever needed to be before. She smiled at the right times. She asked questions about the land with what appeared to be genuine interest, which it was, but not for the reasons he believed. She let him point out the valley and the spring and the quality of the grazing, and she watched his hands on the reins and thought about the man who had written her father's name in a deed registration, and then arranged for her father to be alone and unprotected in a wild country. This could all be something quite remarkable, Wesley said, sweeping his arm toward the horizon with the proprietary confidence of a man who owned everything he could see. With the right partnership. It is remarkable country, she agreed. He looked at her sideways. You are not what I expected, Miss Hart. What did you expect? Someone softer, he said, and she could not tell if it was a compliment or a warning. The women who come west on their own tend not to be soft, she said pleasantly, and turned her horse back toward town. Robert went to the Morales chapel that night, as he had said he would. The Morales family, one of the original Spanish land grant families in the region, had largely moved south after the troubles of the previous decade, and the small chapel on the edge of their property sat empty but well-maintained, as if someone still felt an obligation to it. Robert let himself in with the ease of a man who moved quietly by nature and found the broken cross on the wall and counted 3 boards from the door. The iron box was exactly where Harlan Hart had said it would be. Robert did not open it in the chapel. He rode back with it wrapped in his saddlebag and let himself into the stable and sat on a hay bale in the dark with a lantern turned low and opened the box. The deed was there. 40 acres, northeast quadrant, registered to Harlan Hart, witnessed and notarized, dated June 1877. Legal, clear, and irrefutable. There was also a second document which Robert had not expected. It was a sworn statement, in Harlan Hart's handwriting, witnessed by 2 names Robert did not recognize but could likely track down. The statement described, in straightforward and plainly terrifying terms, 3 separate incidents in which Wesley Crane had threatened Harlan Hart's life if he did not sign over the land, and 1 incident in which Crane had sent 2 men to beat him badly enough that he had been unable to walk for 4 days. Robert sat with this document and felt something cold and clear settle in his chest. This was not just a property dispute. This was evidence of assault and coercion. Combined with the suspicious circumstances of Harlan Hart's death, it might very well be evidence of something worse. He could not go to Presidio without Elsie. The deed needed to be accompanied by the legal heir in order to file properly. He could not explain the deed's existence without explaining how he had known where to find it, which meant involving Elsie regardless. And he could not tell Elsie about the second document without acknowledging what he already suspected and what she already knew. He went to bed that night with the iron box under his floorboard, and he lay awake for a long time thinking about a woman with steady gray eyes and a burned letter, and a very particular kind of courage. The next 3 days were a careful, complicated dance. Elsie continued her courtship performances with Wesley Crane, who was growing increasingly confident and therefore slightly less careful. He had taken to touching her elbow as he guided her down the street, small territorial gestures, and he had started talking about a wedding date in terms that implied a conclusion already reached rather than a question being considered. Elsie listened and deflected and asked questions about her father's property with what she framed as the practical concern of a woman wanting to understand what she might be bringing to a marriage. Wesley's answers were informative in what they chose not to say. He told her the property had been, unfortunately, in some administrative confusion since her father's death, and that he, as mayor, had been working to sort it out on her behalf. He told her that 40 acres was not enormous, but that in combination with his own holdings, it would be quite significant. He told her there was some question about whether the original deed registration was entirely in order, and that he expected to have it clarified very soon. She understood then that he already knew the deed existed and was trying to get his hands on it before she did. Robert and Elsie met 3 more times during those 3 days, always at times and in places that would not draw attention. The early morning kitchen, with Clara conveniently elsewhere. A chance encounter at the general store. A very brief exchange outside the church on Sunday, while everyone was occupied with the social rituals of coming and going. Each conversation was practical and necessary and contained, beneath the practicality, something else that neither of them acknowledged directly. He was careful with her, not cautious in the way of someone who doesn't trust, but careful in the way of someone who values what they are handling. He listened to her with the same quality of attention she had noticed on the first morning, and it was addictive in the way that being genuinely seen is always addictive, especially to someone who has spent years being mostly invisible. She noticed things about him. The way he was always fractionally more alert than his relaxed posture suggested. The dry, quiet humor that emerged in small, surprising moments. The scar on his left hand from something he had not explained, and which she had decided not to ask about yet. The way he said her name, not Elsie but Miss Hart, with a formality that should have been distancing, and was instead, somehow, intimate, as though the careful use of her full name was a kind of respect that went beyond courtesy. She was falling in love with him, and she knew it, and she felt it was extraordinarily inconvenient timing. On the 4th day, 2 things happened. The first was that Wesley Crane arrived at Clara's boarding house and asked to speak with Elsie privately, and in the parlor with the door closed, he told her, with his smile entirely in place but his eyes very flat, that he had reason to believe that someone had been asking around town about her father's property on her behalf, and that he wanted to reassure her that she did not need anyone acting on her behalf because he had everything entirely in hand. It was a warning, and she heard it. "I appreciate that," she said. "I hope you understand that a woman in my position naturally asks questions." "Naturally," he agreed. "But some questions asked in the wrong ears can complicate matters that are otherwise quite simple." "I will keep that in mind," she said. After he left, she sat in the parlor for 5 minutes with her hands folded in her lap, and then she went to find Robert. The second thing that happened was that one of Wesley Crane's men, a tall, lean individual named Briggs who wore his gun low and his expression lower, came to Clara Beaumont's boarding house while Elsie was still in the parlor and searched Robert Sutton's room. Robert was not there. He had taken the iron box to a different location 2 days earlier, because something in the quality of Crane's behavior had told him that waiting was becoming risky. But Briggs found the letter from the San Antonio legal firm that Robert had been careless enough to leave folded in his coat pocket. And now Wesley Crane knew exactly who Robert Sutton was and what he was doing in Rattlesnake Flats. The collision of these 2 things meant that they had run out of time. Elsie found Robert at the stable, and the look on her face when she told him about the conversation in the parlor was enough. He told her about the letter and about Briggs. They stood in the low afternoon light of the stable with the horses moving quietly in their stalls, and they looked at each other with the shared understanding of 2 people who have just realized that the careful plan has been overtaken by events. "We have to go tonight," he said. "Presidio is a full day's ride," she said. "2 horses, starting at midnight. We can be at the county seat before sunset tomorrow. He will know where we are going." "Yes." "He'll send Briggs." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you afraid?" "Of Briggs?" He considered it honestly. "Not particularly. Of what happens if we don't make it in time?" He met her eyes. "Yes," she nodded. I will be ready at midnight. What neither of them had anticipated was that Wesley Crane would move first. He must have had someone watching the stable, because at 11:30, when Elsie came quietly down the back stairs of the boarding house with her bag over her shoulder, she found two of Crane's men waiting at the bottom, and she found herself being redirected, firmly, to the saloon, which was where Wesley Crane was waiting with the gun and the questions about the deed, and the moment that this whole story had been rushing toward from the beginning. The man who had pressed the gun to the back of her neck was the man she had almost, out of desperation and misplaced trust, agreed to become engaged to. And the man who had kicked the saloon door open at exactly the right moment was the man she had burned a letter for, and counted floorboards for, and sat across kitchen tables from in the early mornings when the light was coming in sideways through the windows, and was already most of the way in love with despite having known him for 4 days. After Wesley Crane was on the floor with a bullet through his shooting hand and Robert Sutton had confirmed that Elsie was unharmed, things moved quickly in the way that things move when a held breath is finally released. Clara Beaumont, who had woken to the sound of the shot and who turned out to own a very serviceable shotgun, appeared in the saloon doorway approximately 2 minutes after Robert. She took one look at Wesley Crane on the floor and said, with the air of someone whose suspicions have been comprehensively confirmed, "I knew it." Robert sent her to fetch the local sheriff, a man named Aldous Pike who was, to his considerable credit, not one of Wesley Crane's people. Sheriff Pike arrived to find Wesley Crane sitting propped against the bar with his hand wrapped in a bar cloth, Elsie Hart standing very straight and controlled near the window, and Robert Sutton holding both the iron box and a manner of absolute composure that Pike, who had seen many things, found slightly unnerving. The next few hours were a combination of formal statements, the production of Harlan Hart's documents from the iron box, and a series of revelations that expanded like rings in water. The sworn statement in Harlan Hart's handwriting identified 2 witnesses, both of whom were still in the county. One of them, a Mexican rancher named Eduardo Morales who had stayed while his family moved south and who had been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for someone to ask the right questions, came forward before morning. Eduardo Morales's testimony, added to the documentary evidence in the iron box, gave Sheriff Pike more than enough to hold Wesley Crane pending the arrival of a circuit judge. The 2 men who had redirected Elsie to the saloon were taken into custody as well. Briggs, who had apparently better judgment about lost causes than his employer, was not found in town the following morning and was not found thereafter. Wesley Crane, sitting in the jail cell that his own civic improvements had helped construct, looked at Elsie through the bars when she came to stand outside them in the pale light of the following morning. "You burned the letter," he said. "It was not a question." "I memorized it first," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Your father was a stubborn man." "Yes," she said, "he was." She left the jail without saying anything more, and she walked out into the morning street of Rattlesnake Flats and stood for a moment in the rising light and breathed in a way that she had not been able to breathe since she had arrived. Robert was waiting outside. He had been leaning against the wall in that way he had, casual and alert at the same time, and he straightened when she came out. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. They looked at each other in the morning light. The street was beginning to come alive around them, the blacksmith's hammer starting up its rhythm, someone opening the shutters of the general store, a dog crossing the dust between the buildings with the casual authority of a creature who owned the whole enterprise. "I need to go to Presidio to file the deed properly," she said. "I know. I would like you to come with me." A pause. "As a legal witness." "Among other things," she said, and held his gaze. He had a way, she had noticed, of going very still when something mattered to him. He went still now, and then one corner of his mouth moved, and it was not quite a smile, and it was not quite not a smile, and he said, "I'll saddle the horses." The ride to Presidio took most of a long day. They rode through country that was beautiful and hard in equal measure, the kind of landscape that makes philosophical claims about permanence and scale. Red rock and dry scrub and the distant purple line of mountains against a sky so blue it seemed excessive, like a color an artist would be criticized for overdoing. They talked for much of it, not about the events of the night before, not at first. They talked about smaller things. She told him about growing up in Kansas City, about the rooming houses and the seamstress work, and the feeling of being stuck in a life that fit like a dress made for someone else. He told her about Tennessee, carefully at first and then with less caution, about a family that had been fractured by the war and the subsequent years in the way that so many families had been, and about the decision to move west, which had been less a decision than a direction his life had taken when he stopped standing still. "The legal work," she said. "Do you like it?" He considered. "I like the problem solving," he said. "I like when something that was wrong gets made right. I don't always like the methods required." He paused. "I'm not a lawyer, I'm more of a finder of things." "You found me," she said, and then was quiet for a moment. "I mean the deed." "I know what you meant," he said, and said nothing more, but there was something in the way he said it that made the back of her neck warm. They camped one night on the road because the distance was too great for a single day. He set up camp with practiced efficiency and made coffee with camp equipment he carried in his saddlebag, and they sat across the fire from each other in the immense quiet of the West Texas night, which is a quiet so complete and so star-filled that it makes everything feel both very small and very significant at the same time. "Tell me about my father," she said. "Not what you found out, what you think happened." He looked at her across the fire for a long moment. "I think your father was an honest man who found something valuable and knew he had found it. And I think Wesley Crane recognized that your father would not be bought or frightened and made a decision." He paused. "I think the fall that killed him was not a fall." She had known this. She had known it in the way you sometimes know things that you cannot prove and cannot name. But hearing it said plainly, by someone she trusted, by someone who had the clarity of the outside observer, made it real in a different way. Her eyes were bright, and she did not look away from the fire. "Can we prove it?" she asked. "Crane will go to trial on the charges we have. The assault evidence alone will send him away for years. The suspicious circumstances of your father's death will be part of the investigation." He paused again. "I don't know if we can prove murder. I think we can prove enough that justice is served." She was quiet for a long time, and he let the quiet be what it was. "He was not always a drifter," she said finally. "My father, he was a schoolteacher when I was small. He taught himself surveying in his 40s. He loved land the way some people love music. He would describe a piece of ground to you and make it sound like a symphony." A pause. "He found that valley, and I think he thought his luck had finally turned." "It has," Robert said. "Just not in the way either of you expected." She looked at him. The fire was between them, painting everything in amber and shadow, and he was looking at her with an expression that he was not quite managing to keep neutral. "Robert," she said. "Elsie," he said. It was the first time he had called her that, and they both noticed. "When this is over," she said, "when the deed is filed and the trial is scheduled and all of it is accounted for, what are you going to do?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I haven't decided," he said. "That's not entirely true," she said. His mouth moved into that almost smile again. "No," he admitted. "It's not entirely true." They arrived in Presidio the following afternoon and went directly to the county land office. The filing took 2 hours and involved a great deal of paperwork and the scrutiny of a clerk named Mr. Farwell, who had the skeptical precision of a man who had been deceived by documents before and intended never to be deceived again. But the deed was in order, the notarization was valid, the witnesses were verifiable, and Elsie Hart walked out of the Presidio County Land Office as the legal owner of 40 acres with an underground spring in a valley in West Texas. She stood on the front step of the land office and looked at the piece of stamped paper in her hand and said nothing at all for a moment. Robert stood beside her. "He would have been very pleased," he said quietly. She folded the paper with great care and put it in her coat pocket, close to where the letter had been in her father's Bible. Yes, she said, he would have. They ate dinner that evening at the only restaurant in Presidio that was not also a saloon, a small establishment run by a Mexican family whose food was the best either of them had eaten in months, and they sat across from each other in the warm light and talked and ate and talked more, and at some point during the meal, the careful professional distance between them, which had already been steadily eroding for days, simply and quietly dissolved. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no dramatic declaration. It was more that at some point she said something that made him laugh, a real laugh rather than the dry, small amusements he usually permitted himself, and the sound of it caught her entirely off guard because she had not known he had it in him, that kind of unguarded delight, and the look on her face in response to the sound of his laugh made him look at her with absolutely everything showing for a moment before he collected himself. "I'm sorry," she said, not knowing exactly what she was apologizing for. "Don't be," he said, and reached across the table and covered her hand with his briefly and then withdrew it. The withdrawal was what confirmed it, the care in it. The acknowledgement of something present without presuming possession of it. They rode back to Rattlesnake Flats the next morning with the deed filed and the night's unspoken conversation between them. And the return journey was different from the departure in the way that all returns are different, carrying something new back to a changed landscape. The weeks that followed were busy and revealing, and in many ways, a different kind of difficult from what had come before. The circuit judge arrived in Rattlesnake Flats 3 weeks after the events in the saloon, and the proceedings against Wesley Crane were conducted with the methodical thoroughness of a legal system that, when it functioned, was capable of genuine justice. Eduardo Morales testified. The sheriff testified. Robert testified, in precise and careful language, about the contents of the iron box and the process by which he had found them. 2 of Wesley Crane's former associates, offered reduced charges in exchange for cooperation, testified to coercion and intimidation in the property dealings of the previous 2 years. Elsie testified about the letter from her father. Not the original, which no longer existed, but the substance of it, which she repeated with the accuracy of a woman who had read it many times before she burned it. She described the advertisement that had brought her to Rattlesnake Flats and Wesley Crane's behavior throughout the courtship, including the final night in the saloon. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, and the courtroom was very quiet while she spoke. Wesley Crane was convicted on charges of assault, coercion, and fraud. The investigation into Harlan Hart's death was referred to the state level, where it would take time but where the additional testimony of the witnesses Harlan had named in his sworn statement was expected to significantly advance the case. It was not everything. It was not immediate, but it was real, and it was begun. On the day of the verdict, Elsie stood on the street outside the makeshift courthouse, and Robert came to stand beside her. He had been there throughout the proceedings, not loudly, not obtrusively, but consistently, and she had noticed every single day that he was there. "It's not finished," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's started." She turned to look at him. "Are you going back to San Antonio?" A pause. "The firm will expect a report," he said. "And after the report," he looked at her directly. "I find that I would rather stay," he said, "if that's agreeable." "On what basis?" she asked, and her voice was steady but her eyes were not. "I thought I would offer my services," he said, "as someone experienced in property matters, to the new owner of 40 acres with an underground spring who will presumably need help developing her land." "A business arrangement," she said. "To start," he said. She looked at him for a long time. "Clara Beaumont," she said, "would have a great deal to say about this." "Clara Beaumont," he said, "already has a great deal to say about everything, and I have found that she is usually right." She laughed, and the sound of it went up into the blue Texas sky, and he watched her laugh with a look on his face that he had entirely stopped trying to hide. "All right," she said. "To start." What followed the trial was a season of building, and Elsie Hart found, to her considerable satisfaction, that she was very good at it. The 40 acres needed work. The small cabin her father had built on the property was sound but basic, and the land around the spring needed clearing and some basic irrigation work to be genuinely productive. These were not small tasks, and she did not attempt them alone. Robert was there every day as he had said he would be, and he was as good as his word in the practical sense. He knew horses and he knew land, and he could fix things that broke, which in the building of a life in West Texas meant a great deal. Eduardo Morales, who it turned out had known Harlan Hart and had considerable expertise with the land and the water rights in that particular valley, became an ally and eventually a friend. His presence was a reminder of something important, which was that this land had histories longer than any single claim could contain, and that building something honest on it meant acknowledging those histories and working within the community that already existed rather than over it. Elsie made it a point to learn from him and from the other families in the area, and the cross-cultural relationships she built in those months were both practical and genuinely valuable in a human sense that she had not anticipated and was grateful for. Clara Beaumont visited the property on a warm afternoon in July and stood at the edge of the cleared land near the spring and said, looking at the view, "Your father was right. It is remarkable." Elsie stood beside her and felt the complicated, layered emotion of someone standing in a place they fought for that belongs to someone they loved who cannot see it. "He would have been good here," she said. "You're going to be good here," Clara said. Then she looked sideways at Robert, who was at the far end of the clearing doing something constructive with a fence post. "Both of you." "Clara," Elsie said. "I am merely observing," Clara said serenely, and turned to go back to the buckboard. The courtship, if it could be called that, was nothing like the performance of courtship that Wesley Crane had provided. It was made entirely of ordinary things given meaning by their accumulation. Coffee in the mornings with the light coming across the land. Long evenings on the porch of the cabin that was gradually becoming less basic and more a home. Conversations that started practically and ended somewhere entirely other. The particular way he had of listening, with his whole attention, that made her feel that her words landed somewhere rather than simply dispersing into air. There was a night in late July when a storm came in from the southwest with the speed and drama that West Texas storms have, and they were working late on the cabin and did not have time to get the horses in before the rain came down like a wall. They ran for the porch together and stood under its narrow overhang watching the lightning walk across the sky, drenched and laughing, and she turned to say something about the absurdity of it and found him much closer than she expected. He looked at her for a moment in the light of the storm, water running down his face, his expression stripped of all the careful management it usually carried. "I should tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I think I fell in love with you approximately 4 days after you arrived," he said, "and I have spent the subsequent months being extremely professional about it, and I don't particularly want to be professional about it anymore." The rain was very loud on the porch roof. 4 days, she said. "It may have been 3, he said. "I was trying to be conservative." She looked at him, this man who had ridden into a dark saloon for her, who had kept her father's documents safe, who had listened to her talk about her father around a campfire without flinching from the emotion of it, who made coffee carefully and fixed fence posts, and had a dry, devastating humor that ambushed her at unexpected moments. "It was 3 days for me," she said. "I remember because it was the conversation in the stable." Something in his face opened in the way that something carefully enclosed opens when it is finally permitted to. He kissed her in the rain, on the porch of a cabin her father had built on land her father had found, and that she had fought for and won. And the lightning lit up the whole valley, and the horses in the newly finished corral stood quietly in the downpour. And it was, Elsie thought, with a happiness so complete it was almost uncomfortable, exactly as it should be. They were married in October, in the small church in Rattlesnake Flats that now had its steeple completed, because the town had continued to grow and improve, and the absence of Wesley Crane and his particular form of quiet tyranny had let a more genuine kind of community begin to develop. Clara Beaumont organized the wedding with the same focused intensity she applied to her coffee making. Eduardo Morales came with his wife Maria and their 3 children and brought flowers from his land. Sheriff Pike attended and shook Robert's hand with great sincerity and told him that he was glad somebody had ridden in when he had, and Robert said that he was glad too, in a way that made it clear he was not talking primarily about the situation in the saloon. Elsie wore her second-best dress, which she had altered herself and which fit considerably better than it had in Kansas City, and stood in front of the minister with Robert and made promises that she felt entirely prepared to keep. He held her hand with careful steadiness, as he held most things, and when the minister pronounced them married and he turned to look at her, his eyes were the expression of a man who has found something he did not know he had lost and intends never to be careless with it. The reception was held at Clara's boarding house, which was the largest interior space available, and lasted until well past midnight because nobody wanted to stop, which is the mark of a party that was genuinely needed. The state-level investigation into Harlan Hart's death concluded the following spring, and it concluded as Robert had predicted it would. 2 of the men who had worked directly for Wesley Crane gave additional testimony that was specific enough to result in a second indictment, this one for the death. It was not, the prosecutor acknowledged, an airtight case for murder in the first degree, but it was sufficient for manslaughter under circumstances of criminal coercion, and Wesley Crane, already serving 5 years for his other convictions, received an additional 7 years on top of them. Elsie received this news on a morning in March, sitting at the table in the cabin that had been considerably expanded over the winter, and now included a proper kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a covered porch that ran the full width of the front. Robert handed her the letter from the prosecutor's office and she read it and put it down and was quiet for a moment. "It is not enough," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it is what the law can do, and it is something." She nodded slowly. "He will know for the rest of his life that we won," she said, "that the land is mine and my father is remembered and Wesley Crane is in a prison cell." She paused. "That matters." "It does," Robert said. She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, "for coming here, for the legal firm's letter on your desk, for all of it." He sat down across from her as he had sat across from her at the boarding house table in what felt like a different era, and he said, "I need to tell you something I have been thinking about for a while." She raised an eyebrow. "Another 4 days confession, a different kind." He folded his hands on the table. "I want to stay here permanently, not as a representative of the San Antonio firm. I've already sent them a letter ending that arrangement." He met her eyes. "I would like this to be my life. The land, the valley, this town. I want to be here the way Eduardo Morales is here, with roots in it." She looked at him with the expression she had when something moved her that she was not fully prepared to be moved by. "You're already here," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to say it out loud." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, a deliberate mirror of what he had done in the restaurant in Presidio 8 months ago. "You're home," she said, "if you want to be." He turned his hand over and held hers, and that was the end and the beginning of that particular conversation. The spring brought new work and new plans. Robert's experience in land and legal matters made him genuinely useful to more than just their own property. Several families in the area had disputes or questions about their holdings, and he began, informally at first, to offer advice and assistance. It became a practice of sorts, not a formal legal office but a known resource, and the reputation he built was built on fairness and thoroughness and an absolute refusal to take advantage of the people who came to him. The spring also brought Elsie's first confirmed pregnancy, which she announced to Robert on an April morning with a combination of joy and the slight anxiety of someone who is very aware of the significance of what they are saying. He received it with everything he had, which was a great deal. His face went through several things in rapid succession, surprise and then a flooding happiness that he did not try to contain, and he stood up from the chair he had been sitting in and came around the table and held her, carefully and completely, for a long moment. "Are you well?" he asked into her hair. "Very well," she said. "Good." He held her for another moment. "Good." Clara Beaumont, informed a week later, said immediately and without pause, "I knew it," and then proceeded to be practically useful in approximately 16 different ways simultaneously. Eduardo Morales and his wife, Maria, came to dinner the evening Elsie and Robert shared the news with them, and Maria, who was warm and perceptive in equal measure, watched the two of them across the table the way you watch something that has turned out well and you want to appreciate the fullness of it. "Your father would have loved this," she said to Elsie. "He would have tried to give Robert advice about the land," Elsie said. "And Robert would have listened and then done things his own way," Clara said. "That is accurate," Robert said mildly, and Eduardo laughed, and the table was full of warmth and the particular joy of people who have come through difficulty together and are now, improbably and wonderfully, sitting in a lamplit kitchen with good food and sufficient laughter. The baby was born in November of 1880. A boy. Arrived in the early morning hours after a long labor that Robert spent mostly outside the bedroom door, being progressively more useless to everyone around him, including himself. Clara Beaumont managed the birth with the assistance of Maria Morales, and when she finally opened the bedroom door and told Robert he could come in, he entered the room with the expression of a man who has been thoroughly humbled by events beyond his control. Elsie was sitting up in the bed, tired and radiant in the specific way of women who have just done something enormous, and she held a small, red-faced, determinedly vocal boy wrapped in the blanket that Elsie had made herself during the preceding months. "He is very loud," Robert said. "He is," Elsie agreed. "Come look at your son." He came and looked, and the expression on his face was beyond description or analysis, one of those pure, undefended human moments that are too complete for language. They named him Harlan Robert Sutton, and Clara declared it a perfect name, and immediately began referring to him as Harlan in the direct, proprietary manner of a woman who has decided she is the child's unofficial grandmother, and intends to proceed on that basis without waiting to be confirmed. The years that followed were full. They were not always easy. West Texas in the 1880s remained a place of periodic difficulty, drought and cattle disputes, and the ongoing complicated questions of a frontier society trying to determine what it was going to become. Robert's informal land practice grew and formalized enough that he began to correspond regularly with the legal firm in San Antonio, and eventually, with the encouragement of an attorney he met at the county seat, began studying for the bar through correspondence, applying himself with the same quiet tenacity he applied to everything he decided to do. Elsie expanded the farm, which was what they called it, though it was always more than that. The spring that fed the valley made it genuinely productive, and she planted with advice from the Morales family, and from a catalog of agricultural texts that she ordered through the general store, and which arrived battered and useful. She grew food and she grew income, and she built something on those 40 acres that her father had found and she had saved. And there were mornings when she walked the edge of the land in the early light, and felt him there in the particular way that the deeply loved dead are present in the places they cherished. Their second child came 2.5 years after Harlan, a girl they named Frances, after Robert's mother, who had died when he was young and whose memory he carried with the same careful respect that Elsie carried her father's. Frances was a quiet, observant child who absorbed everything around her and periodically produced, at entirely unexpected moments, observations of such precision and originality that everyone in the room would stop talking and look at her. Clara Beaumont, whose own health had begun to vary in ways that concerned everyone who knew her, declared that Frances was the sharpest child she had ever met, and that she expected great things from her. Clara was 61 when she died, quietly in her sleep, in the spring of 1883. Elsie sat with her the night before, and Clara was not afraid, which was not surprising, and she was not particularly sentimental, which was entirely characteristic of her. She said, near the end of the evening, looking at Elsie with the absolute directness that had defined her from the first conversation, "I thought when you got off that buckboard that you were either very brave or very desperate." "Both," Elsie said. "Yes," Clara said. "Both tends to work out better than either one alone." She closed her eyes and did not open them again after that evening, and the town of Rattlesnake Flats turned out for her funeral in the numbers that are reserved for people who have been genuinely central to a community. Robert spoke at the graveside, briefly and well, in the way that people who use words sparingly use them best when they are needed. Clara left her boarding house to Elsie, which was not entirely expected. In her will, written in her characteristic direct prose, she specified that the boarding house should continue operating and that Elsie should decide its future, because she trusted Elsie's judgment, and because Clara had strong opinions about property going to sensible people. The boarding house continued operating. Elsie hired a capable woman named Margaret Delacroix to run it, and Margaret did so with an efficiency that would have satisfied Clara herself, which was a very high standard. The third pregnancy came in 1884, announced again at the kitchen table on a morning that had become, through long use, their table for everything important. Robert received this news with slightly more composure than the first, though no less happiness. "We are going to need a larger house," he said. "We are already building a larger house," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm just noting that the timing is appropriate." He passed the bar examination in the spring of 1885, having studied through 3 West Texas winters in the manner of a man conducting a personal campaign, and Elsie made a dinner that went on for 3 hours and included everyone who mattered to them, which was, by that point, a significant number of people. Eduardo Morales raised a glass and gave a toast in a mixture of English and Spanish that Robert followed in both languages, because he had learned, because learning was the only respectful response to living and working in a country that spoke a language older than any of the Anglo claims on it. The third child was another boy, named James, who arrived in the fall of 1884 with considerably more urgency than his siblings, and immediately demonstrated a personality that could be described as enthusiastic at the low end and catastrophic at the high end. Harlan, at 5, received him with the specific caution of an eldest child encountering evidence that the universe has more coming. Frances, at 2.5, was fascinated and slightly proprietary in a way that suggested she intended to be the authority on the new arrival. Robert, watching his 3 children navigate each other across the kitchen floor one evening in the autumn of 1885, had an expression that Elsie had come to associate with moments when he was experiencing something too large for his usual emotional economy. She sat beside him and followed his gaze. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the lamplight of the kitchen with the sound of the children and the warm smell of wood smoke and the knowledge, grounded and complete, of everything they had made from a burned letter and a gun in a dark saloon, and 3 days in which 2 people had understood each other. There is something that needs to be said about the nature of what Elsie and Robert had built, because it was not simple and it did not pretend to be. The West Texas frontier of the 1880s was a place where justice was partial and inconsistent, where the people who had the deepest roots in the land were often the ones with the least protection under the law, and where the promises of a new country were distributed with remarkable inequality. Robert's legal practice, which was formal now and growing, took cases that other attorneys considered unprofitable, including land disputes on behalf of Mexican families whose original claims predated statehood and were routinely contested by Anglo settlers. He lost some of these cases. He won more than people expected, and the wins mattered in ways that extended beyond the individual clients. Elsie understood this work and supported it without sentiment or naivete. She had come to Rattlesnake Flats as a woman with nothing but a Bible and a burned letter, and she had watched a corrupt man use legal machinery to steal and harm and kill, and she had seen how the law could be either a weapon or a shield depending entirely on who held it and how. She wanted Robert to hold it carefully. He did. The investigation into her father's death produced, in 1886, a final legal accounting. Wesley Crane, serving the remainder of his combined sentence, did not contest the last of the proceedings and simply received the judgment in silence. The man who had press-ganged 2 local men into the violence against Harlan Hart had died in prison 2 years prior, which gave the final reckoning a somewhat incomplete feeling. But the official record contained, now and permanently, the name Harlan Hart as a man who had been wronged and whose wrong had been acknowledged by the state that had failed to protect him. It was something. It was not enough. It was something. Elsie stood at her father's grave on the afternoon. She received the final documents in the small cemetery at the edge of Rattlesnake Flats, where he had been buried before she ever arrived in this country. She had placed a proper headstone there in her first year, with his name and dates and the word beloved, which was the truest thing she knew about him. She stood there alone, because some visits need to be alone, and she told him about the house and the children and the land, and she told him that the spring was running full and the valley was beautiful, and she had not let anyone take it from her. Robert came to find her after a while, because that is what he did. He walked up beside her and stood quietly, reading the headstone as he had read it many times before. After a moment he said, "The case in Presidio next week." "I know," she said. She had been helping him prepare the documents for a family whose claim had been improperly contested for 3 years. "We are almost ready. Eduardo has offered to testify about the original land use records." "Good." She was quiet. "It's a good case." He put his hand on her shoulder, and they stood at the grave for a while longer as the afternoon settled toward evening, and the light went long and golden across the cemetery grass. In the winter of 1887, with 3 children running through a proper farmhouse, and a law practice that required its own office in town, and 40 acres that produced more every year, Elsie sat down one evening and wrote a letter. She addressed it to the Kansas City Evening Star. In it, she described, simply and without embellishment, her experience of answering a matrimonial advertisement in the West, and the reality that awaited women who answered such things without sufficient information. She was not unkind, and she was not naively warning, because the West needed people and many of the advertisements were genuine. But she described what questions a woman should ask, what records she should verify, what signs should prompt caution, and what resources were available in each county seat for a woman who arrived to find something different from what was advertised. The letter was published. She received 2 responses from women in her situation. She wrote back to both of them with the same careful specificity she had brought to everything since the morning she had sat in a boarding house kitchen and decided to trust a quiet man with dark eyes. Robert read the letter in the paper and said nothing about it for a day, and then said at dinner, "You should write more of those." She looked up. "More letters, a column maybe, or a guide." He met her eyes. "You have particular expertise in the subject." She considered it. "The paper might not be interested." "Write the second letter and find out," he said. In the direct, simple way he encouraged her toward things he believed she was capable of, that she was still approaching with caution. She wrote the second letter. The paper was interested. The guide, published in installments over the following 18 months in 3 different Western papers, was reprinted and distributed through women's organizations in Kansas City and St. Louis. Elsie received more letters than she could answer, but she answered as many as she could, with Margaret Delacroix's help and the increasingly useful assistance of 12-year-old Harlan, who had an excellent hand for copying and who took the work very seriously. James, at 6, tried to eat a letter on one occasion. Frances, at 9, sorted the mail with a methodical thoroughness that was entirely her own. The family grew in the way of something planted in good soil. There were hard seasons, because there always are. A drought in 1888 that tested every farm and ranch in the county. A fever in the winter of 1889 that went through the household and frightened everyone badly before it left. A case that Robert took in 1890 that went badly wrong and cost him significantly in ways both financial and personal. Each of these things was gotten through the way hard things are gotten through, by the people who love each other deciding in each moment of difficulty to face it together. Harlan, at 15, was his mother's child in his methodical practicality, and his father's child in his quiet, precise observation of the world, and he had decided, with the firmness of early adolescence, that he was going to be a lawyer. Robert, hearing this declaration, had said, "Good," with considerable composure, and then gone outside for a few minutes, and Elsie, watching from the window, had seen him standing by the fence looking at nothing and smiling at nothing with an expression she recognized as one of those moments of too full happiness. Frances, at 13, wanted to be a doctor, which was not an easy ambition for a girl in 1893, but Elsie had spent enough of her own life managing difficult ambitions to know better than to discourage it. She told Frances that it would require more work than most things, that the world would not always cooperate, and that the point of knowing what you wanted was to work toward it regardless of those facts. Frances had received this information with the expression of someone who had already calculated the obstacles and was simply waiting for adult confirmation that they were surmountable. Robert, when Frances told him the same ambition, had started a correspondence with a physician in San Antonio about the possibilities available to women who sought medical training, and within the year had identified 2 institutions that might be appropriate when the time came. Frances had received this information with the expression of someone who expected nothing less, but was pleased to have it confirmed. James, at 9, wanted to be a horse trainer, a cowboy, and an explorer simultaneously, and showed no signs of narrowing these ambitions, which everyone privately felt was probably fine. There came a morning in the spring of 1894 when the valley was at its most beautiful, green with the unusual rains they had received that winter and the spring running full and bright between the banks that Robert had worked on over many years. Elsie stood at the edge of the property in the early light, in the place where the land opened up toward the south, and the mountains were visible in the clear morning. She was 42 years old, and she had lived in this valley for 15 years, and the 40 acres had become 120, bought honestly over time from willing sellers, and the house behind her had 6 rooms and a proper garden, and a carved front door that Robert had commissioned from a craftsman in San Antonio. She heard his step behind her, because she had heard it for 15 years and knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. Came to stand beside her holding 2 cups of coffee, as he did on mornings when he knew she had come out here. She took the cup. "I was thinking about the letter," she said. "Which letter?" "My father's letter, the one I burned." She looked at the valley. "I can still hear exactly how it sounded in his handwriting. Do not let anyone take it from you." "We didn't," he said. "We didn't," she agreed. A pause. "I think he knew someone would come." "He hid the deed and wrote the letter," Robert said. "He was preparing for the possibility. He left it for me specifically." She looked at her coffee cup. "He trusted me to find it. He was right." She turned and looked at him in the morning light. 15 years had settled into his face in the way that good years settle, not heavily but with depth. The lines at the corners of his eyes that were from sun, and from the particular expression he had when something amused him, which happened more than it used to. He had grown into something that was completely himself, and she thought, as she had thought many times, that the man on the boarding-house porch with the hat over his face had been this man all along, waiting for circumstances that would let him show it. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her with the attention that had never, in 15 years, diminished. "There is going to be a 4th child," she said. The morning was very still for a moment. The valley spread out below them in the early light, the spring running, the mountains blue and distant. "You are certain," he said. "Very certain." The expression that moved across his face was the same one she had seen in the boarding house kitchen in the first year, the same flooding, uncontained happiness. He had aged and weathered and grown, and she had never once doubted him, and she did not doubt him now. "We are going to need another room," he said. She laughed. "I thought you might say that." "The east side of the house," he said. "I have been thinking about adding to it for a while." "You were waiting," she realized. He said nothing, which was his version of yes. She reached up and touched his face because she could, because after 15 years the right to reach up and touch his face whenever she wished was something she treasured rather than took for granted. He covered her hand with his and held it there. They stood at the edge of the valley their family had grown in, with the coffee getting cold and the light spreading from the east, and the sound of the house beginning to wake behind them. James's voice and then Frances's, and then the particular measured tread of Harlan coming downstairs. And all of it, every sound and every sight and every specific weight of the morning, was the life they had built from a hard beginning and a burned letter and an act of courage on both sides, his and hers, that had found each other in the dark saloon of a dishonest town and had not from that moment looked anywhere else. "Come back inside," she said. "The children will want breakfast." "In a moment," he said. They stood a moment longer. The fourth child, born that November, was a boy, and they named him after Eduardo Morales's suggestion, which was made laughingly at a dinner table, and then received with such seriousness by everyone present that Eduardo had been startled. The child's name was Thomas Harlan Sutton, and he came into the world with the particular emphatic presence of a person who has decided to be here and wants everyone to know it. The house was large and full and warm, and the 40 acres that had started everything were at the center of a larger holding that was productive and real, and the legal office in town had a hand-lettered sign that read Robert Sutton, attorney at law, and the boarding house that Clara Beaumont had left behind was still operating with Margaret Delacroix at its head, a place of reliability and welcome in a town that had grown in 15 years into something that had decided to stay. Wesley Crane served his full sentence and was released in 1891 into complete obscurity. He never returned to Rattlesnake Flats. Elsie, when she heard of his release, noted it and moved on, because the past was a thing to understand and not a thing to live in, and she had a present that required her full attention. Eduardo Morales lived to be very old, which everyone agreed was entirely appropriate. He sat on his porch in his final years and watched the valley with the satisfaction of a man who has seen many things come and go and is pleased with what has stayed. He told Harlan Sutton, who was by then reading law in Presidio under his father's guidance, that the land remembers everything, and the people who understand this do better than the ones who try to rewrite it. Harlan wrote this down, and it stayed with him. Frances left for medical school in 1901, which was a great deal harder to arrange than it should have been and exactly as possible as Elsie had told her it would be. She came back to West Texas 10 years later as a physician, setting up practice in a town 2 counties over, and writing long letters home that were full of the precise, original observations that had been evident in her at 9 years old. James did become a horse trainer and something like a cowboy, and spent 3 years in the territories before coming back to the valley, with a wife named Rosa, and a manner that suggested he had made peace with the idea that home was worth returning to. Thomas, the fourth and last, had a personality that reconciled the decisive practicality of his mother with the steady precision of his father, in a combination that made him, in the opinion of everyone who knew him, impossible to argue with, which he channeled, to no one's surprise, into law. He was at his father's side in the office before he was old enough for it to be formal, and by the time he was 18, he was already the one being asked to explain the difficult cases. On an evening in the spring of 1900, with the century turning and the world changing in ways both hopeful and terrifying, Elsie and Robert sat on the front porch of the house in the long evening light. The valley was quiet, the spring was running, the carved front door was behind them, The years had laid themselves down like good wood, dense and honest. She was 50 years old and she was entirely herself, which is not a small thing to be able to say at any age. He was 55 and had the face of a man who has used his life well, which is its own kind of beauty. They sat with the particular ease of people who have nothing left to prove to each other and nothing left to hide, and the silence between them was the comfortable, inhabited kind, the kind that comes from having been entirely known. 15 years ago, she said, you told me you fell in love with me in 4 days. 3, he said. You said 4 initially. I was being conservative, she smiled. What made you change the conservative position? He turned to look at her in the evening light, and the expression on his face was 21 years of constancy and attention, and the particular kind of love that is not a feeling that arrives but a choice that is made every day and then made again. You burned the letter, he said, and then you came to find me. She looked at him. I needed help. You needed a witness, he said, someone who would hold the truth with you. You decided it was me before you had any reason to know you were right. She thought about this. I looked at you and I thought, that man is not performing. And I was right, she said simply. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat on the porch in the spring evening of the first year of a new century, in the valley that Harlan Hart had found and Elsie Hart had saved and Robert Sutton had helped her keep. And the land spread out before them to the mountains, and the sky was doing its magnificent, excessive best, and it was, in every way that mattered, entirely enough. The story of Elsie and Robert Sutton was told, eventually in pieces, by different people, in the way that stories of this kind get told. Eduardo Morales told it to his grandchildren with particular attention to the importance of keeping sworn statements in iron boxes. Clara Beaumont had told her version of it to anyone who would listen long before she died, and her version was accurate if enthusiastic. The Kansas City Evening Star ran a brief profile of Elsie's column work in 1895 and got several facts wrong, which she corrected in a follow-up letter with characteristic precision. The version Elsie herself told when she told it started not with the advertisement and not with the train ride and not even with the boarding house porch. She started with the letter in the Bible, the small folded paper her father had left for her, the cramped handwriting and the careful map, and the 4 words that contained everything he had wanted for her. Do not let anyone take it from you. He had meant the land. She had understood it to mean more than that. And she had come west with 2 good dresses and a sewing kit and her father's Bible, and she had burned a letter and kept a secret and stood straight in a dark saloon with a gun at the back of her neck. And she had not let anyone take a single thing from her that was rightfully hers, including, most importantly, the life she had chosen and the man who had chosen it with her, who was still there, 15 years and 20 years and beyond, on the porch in the evenings, at the kitchen table in the mornings, steady as the spring in the valley and warm as the light over the mountains, and as entirely, irrevocably, permanently hers as the deed filed in the Presidio County Land Office under the name Elsie Hart. The night the story truly ended, which is to say the night it had no more needing and was simply complete, was an ordinary night, a Thursday in October, 21 years after the stagecoach had stopped in Rattlesnake Flats, and a woman with gray eyes and a carpetbag had stepped into the dust and heat and the wide blank sky of West Texas. The children were elsewhere, as grown children are. The house was quiet. The porch held 2 chairs that had sat in exactly this arrangement for years, worn into the right shape by long use. The valley below was silver in the moonlight, and the spring caught the light the way water always catches light, with a kind of generous excess. Robert came out onto the porch and stood for a moment looking at the view, and then he looked at her, and what was in his face was the whole of it, everything they had been and done and built and lost and found and kept. She reached up her hand. He took it. And that was the whole of it, and it was entirely enough, and it was exactly as it should be.